Anna had always been an avid hiker, a skilled and seasoned wanderer of the wilds. She knew the forest trails like the back of her hand. That's why it was so strange when, on a solo trip to a familiar and secluded section of the woods, she never returned. It was a place she had hiked to countless times, with its dense trees and misty air that had become a part of her life. On the first evening, when Anna didn't return to camp as expected, her friends and family grew concerned. She was experienced, but even seasoned hikers could run into trouble. By the following morning, the anxiety turned into worry, and the search team was dispatched. The trail she had been following was well marked, with signs and landmarks that made it almost impossible to get lost. Yet, despite hours of searching, there was no trace of Anna. The searchers combed the path, checked the river's edge, and even searched places off the beaten trail where Anna might have strayed. It wasn't until they found her campsite that the horror truly began. Her tent was still standing. The small campfire she had built was cold. Her backpack, sleeping bag, and hiking boots were there, untouched. But Anna was nowhere to be found. The search continued, but as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. Anna's footprints, visible at first, seemed to disappear into the ground. No more tracks were found. Only a soft, misty clearing lay ahead. The eerie quiet was the first unsettling sign. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural silence that seemed to cling to the air. Some of the search team members claimed to hear strange noises, rustling in the underbrush, snapping twigs. Others swore they saw shadows flickering at the edges of their vision. The deeper they went into the forest, the more they felt a growing sense of unease, as though they were being watched by something just beyond sight. By the fourth day, the search party had grown tired, both physically and mentally. Yet they had no choice but to push on. They arrived at a strange, untouched area deep within the forest. No signs of Anna, no footprints, no markers of human presence, not even an animal trail. The air felt heavier here, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. At the center of the clearing stood a large rock, its surface covered in an odd, unfamiliar symbol that none of the searchers could identify. It seemed out of place, almost as though it had been there for centuries, forgotten by time. As they circled the rock, unease settled in. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up as the stillness in the air grew suffocating. No one spoke, but the feeling of being observed became unbearable. Then, just when they thought they might be alone in the depths of the forest, a soft voice, barely a whisper, called out. It was a name they all recognized. Anna. The voice echoed through the trees, but the direction was impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a haunting sound that sent chills through the team. They followed the voice for what seemed like hours, but no matter which way they turned, they couldn't find the source. It was as though the forest itself was mocking them. As darkness began to fall on the fifth day of the search, the team reluctantly called it quits. Exhausted, frustrated, and with no answers, they left the woods, knowing in their hearts that something far beyond their understanding had taken place. Anna was never found. In the days that followed, some locals claimed to have seen her, though the stories didn't match up. Some said they had seen her walking into the woods just before the search began, seemingly unaware of the searchers. Others insisted that the forest was cursed and had claimed many before Anna, and that no one ever ventured too deep without being swallowed by its vastness. But Anna's disappearance was never explained. Her name, etched in the memories of those who searched for her, was quietly whispered by the locals who avoided the woods. The trail where she vanished became a place where few dared to go, and for those who did, the chilling feeling of being watched would never leave. Some say Anna is still out there, wandering the misty depths of the forest, lost forever, a part of the wilderness that had claimed her, the haunting voice that called her name. No one has heard it since, but the mystery of the vanishing hiker still lingers in the hearts and minds of those who knew her and the ones who tried to find her. The woods have grown quieter over time, but Anna's disappearance is a story that the forest refuses to let go of, just as it has kept its secrets hidden for so long. The Hawkins family, eager for a quiet weekend in the wilderness, arrived at a remote forest campsite tucked beside a secluded river. It was the perfect escape from the bustle of their busy lives, a place to reconnect with nature and each other. The campsite was serene, surrounded by towering trees and the soft murmur of the river. Their dog, a loyal golden retriever, happily bounded around the camp, keeping them company as they set up their tents and a small fire. That first night, they settled into the rhythm of the forest. The air was fresh, and the world felt peaceful. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, something began to feel off. The dog, usually calm and content, started growling low, his ears perked at the forest's edge. He barked into the darkness, his gaze fixed on something no one else could see. Tom, the father, reassured his wife Claire and son Luke, but the unease lingered in the cool night air. The next morning, as the family began to make breakfast, Tom went out to gather firewood. He told Claire he'd be back in a few minutes. But minutes turned into an hour, and still there was no sign of him. Claire, trying to remain calm, assumed he had wandered farther into the forest or perhaps was delayed by something. But as time passed, worry crept into her thoughts. By noon, Tom was still missing. Claire and Luke set out together to search for him. They called out his name, their voices echoing in the stillness of the forest. But no response came. The trees stood silent, their dense canopy blocking most of the light, casting long, creeping shadows. The further they walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder and the silence heavier. Soon, Claire's phone lost its signal, rendering them even more isolated. The further they ventured into the woods, the more disoriented they became. Luke clung to his mother's side, his eyes darting nervously. Then, in a whisper so soft it could have been the wind, Luke spoke. "Mom, I hear something." Claire froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you hear, sweetheart?" she asked, trying to mask the fear in her voice. Luke's wide eyes met hers. It's calling my name." A chill swept through Claire. The forest felt alive, and not in a comforting way. The trees, now shadowed by the fading light, seemed to shift and move around them. Claire's pulse quickened, and she urged Luke to stay close. But with every step they took, the air grew colder, and the sense of something following them increased. As dusk began to settle over the woods, Claire spotted something near the river's edge. A flash of red fabric caught on a rock. It was Tom's backpack. Her heart leaped, but when she ran over to it, there was no sign of him. No footprints, no trail, nothing but the eerie stillness of the forest. Her mind raced with dread, her stomach sinking. Where could he have gone? The whispers began then, a low hum carried on the wind, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if voices from deep within the forest were calling to them. Claire's skin crawled. "Tom," she called out, her voice shaking. But the only answer was the increasing chorus of whispers, strange voices that seemed to be speaking just beyond her comprehension. Luke's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom, we need to go," he pleaded, but it was already too late. Footsteps sounded behind them, crunching on the forest floor, moving in time with their own. But when they turned, there was no one there. The sound of footsteps, distant at first, was now a constant presence, always behind them. The forest was alive with motion, shifting around them in unnatural ways. The trees, the ground, even the river seemed to warp and twist as they lost their way. Frantic now, Claire and Luke tried to retrace their steps, but the familiar trail had disappeared. The trees, once welcoming and protective, now felt oppressive, as though they were being guided into a maze with no way out. The The sun had set completely, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. Claire's breathing grew erratic. She could hear the whispers more clearly now. There was no escaping them. And then, as the last vestiges of daylight faded, they realized they were no longer just lost. They were being hunted. The night stretched on endlessly, the sound of their pursuers' footsteps echoing through the woods. Claire and Luke's cries for help were swallowed by the thick trees. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the whispers stopped. The silence returned. The next morning, the search for the Hawkins family began. But despite hours of searching, no trace of them could be found. The woods remained silent, as though they had never been there. Months later, hikers passing through the area would occasionally report hearing faint whispers or voices drifting on the wind, but no one dared venture deep enough into the forest to investigate. The Hawkins family's car was discovered abandoned at the edge of the woods, but there was no sign of the family, not even a trail. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the forest. They said it was cursed, that it had claimed many before. No one dared to venture too deep into its heart, where something dark and ancient seemed to wait. The Hawkins family's disappearance was just one more mystery added to the long list of those who had entered the woods and never returned. Jake, Sarah, and Mike were no strangers to adventure. The three teenagers had spent countless weekends exploring the woods and abandoned places around their town. But there was one spot that had always intrigued them: the old, forgotten town deep in the heart of the forest. The town, once a thriving community, had been abandoned years ago after a series of strange and unexplained disappearances. Locals spoke of eerie occurrences, whispers in the wind, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Yet none of that deterred the teens. Despite the warnings from the older generation to stay far away from the forest, Jake, Sarah, and Mike felt invincible. They gathered their cameras and set out on a cool autumn afternoon, eager to capture the haunting beauty of the place. The sky was already beginning to dim as they crossed into the woods, but they didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a little exploring. What could possibly go wrong? The forest around them seemed normal at first: dense trees, the occasional rustle of small animals, and the scent of pine filling the air. But as the hours passed, an unnatural silence began to settle. The wind seemed to die down, and the birds ceased their calls. The teens continued walking deeper, undeterred by the growing stillness. It was Sarah who first noticed something odd. Amidst the underbrush, she spotted a tattered map half buried beneath the dirt. She picked it up, brushing it off, and showed it to the others. The map was old, its paper yellowed and torn at the edges, and marked with strange symbols they didn't recognize. Curiosity piqued, the teens followed the map, unsure of what they were looking for but determined to find whatever it led to. The sky had turned from twilight to dark by the time they reached the edge of the old town. The streets, once bustling with life, were now crumbling, overtaken by the forest. Their excitement only grew, but a nagging feeling lingered in the back of their minds. Sarah's hand trembled as she pointed toward a dilapidated house at the end of a narrow street. "This must be it," she whispered, and with a shared look of resolve they approached. As they stepped closer to the house, the air grew heavy, and a strange acrid smell hung in the air. The house stood like a hollow shell of its former self, windows shattered, doors hanging askew, and the roof sagging under the weight of time. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. They froze, hearts pounding, but it was too late to turn back. The house felt alive, groaning and creaking with every movement they made. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, flickering in the dim light of their flashlights. Sarah's heart raced as she ran her fingers over the carvings, odd, cryptic shapes that didn't belong to any language she knew. As they moved further into the house, the air seemed to thicken, suffocating them with its oppressive weight. A faint hum echoed through the floors, an unsettling sound that made their skin crawl. Suddenly, the house seemed to shift. The walls seemed to move closer, and shadows flickered around them like restless spirits. As the teens turned to leave, they were hit with an even more disturbing realization. The forest outside had changed. The trees were twisted and contorted in unnatural shapes, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. The path they had taken in was gone, replaced by an eerie maze of trails that led nowhere. The air was thick with something that felt wrong, suffocating. Panic set in. Mike's breath became shallow as he scanned the woods, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. Now. But every direction they turned led them deeper into the maze. The forest had transformed into something else, something alive and watching. They tried to call for help, but their phones were dead, their screens black and lifeless. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, echoing their names. Jake, Sarah, and Mike looked around frantically, but no matter where they turned, there was no escape. The house they had entered seemed to shift and move, its location changing with every step they took. The shadows pressed in on them from every side, the whispers growing louder. Mike began to scream, his voice swallowed by the forest, but it was as if the world had turned against them. The trees seemed to close in, blocking their way, and the forest grew darker and more twisted with every passing moment. Then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the silence returned. The whispers stopped. The trees no longer moved. The teens found themselves standing in the center of the forest, disoriented and lost. But as dawn broke, they realized the truth. There was no way out. They were trapped. The next day, a search party was dispatched, but despite their efforts, they found nothing. No sign of Jake, Sarah, or Mike. Only their belongings, left behind near the edge of the woods, untouched and undisturbed. It wasn't long before locals began to speak of the cursed house, the one that had burned down decades ago. Yet some swore they had seen it, standing there in the woods, unchanged. Year after year, hikers passing through the area would claim to hear faint voices drifting on the wind, calling out for the teens. Others swore they saw 3 figures moving among the trees, their forms faint and indistinct, forever lost in the forest. Jake, Sarah, and Mike had vanished without a trace, and the forest kept its secrets, unwilling to release them.